All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We got some people joining up, so we can go ahead and get rocking and rolling here. If you guys are not familiar, this is Gareth Locke. Gareth actually came to the shop, last year. When was that? Jeez, the fall? Spring?
Yeah, it would have been, yeah.
Yeah. And we did the human factor stuff in-house, which is a very interesting experience, it was excellent, but it was an interesting experience overall. Gareth has a book, Under Pressure, and a website which I'll post up on these that we actually require for our technical dive training and our professional dive training, which I think is super valuable. One of the first questions I got for you, what current projects, I know you got some stuff you're working on, what current projects do you kind of got going on that people can do kind of from home or just in general?
So I always have the online microclass, which is about sort of 2.5, 3 hours worth of online training through sort of 15, 20-minute segments about topics. And that's been really quite successful, and a number of people like Jason who are using it as pre-learning for technical instructor development, giving them a better insight into how people operate, why they behave the way they do, why they appear to do stupid stuff, and importantly, what we can do to improve our decision-making and situational awareness and things like that. So that's always been an online offering. And now in the last couple of days, I've put together, and it starts on Monday, a 10-week webinar-based program. Similar to this, it's run through Zoom. And the idea is that once a week, we will meet for about 45, 60 minutes, delivering some theory, some content, case studies. And then there's about sort of 15 to 30 minutes of Q&A. And then they'll get homework to develop themselves further. And then we come on the following week and we'll deliver another topic. So it's a 10-week program that starts on Monday. I ran a similar one a couple of years ago, and it was really successful. So you visit the Human Diver page. There is a link for that. Go off, and it's $250 for 10 hours worth, or in fact 15 hours worth of work plus the homework that you get feedback on. So it's all about developing you as an individual. It's trying to fill the gaps between the inability now to do face-to-face training. That's obviously limited globally in what we can do. So that's sort of the two projects, the online projects I've got at the moment, and anywhere on the blog. If you've got time to read, there's a whole bunch of stuff there.
Which you should at this point in time.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And if you've got people who are multilingual, I'm posting translations of the blogs up there and tagging them on with the languages that are there. So I've got a number of instructors who translated work. If you want to go on the Jason's list and speaks different language, give us a shout, and we can put a translated blog up there.
Nice. That online class you guys got going, are there spots left? And what? Can you talk a little bit more about that, like instructor level?
Yeah,
what is
about
that?
15 slots left on that. So.
Is that for instructors only? Who?
No, it's for everybody really. Anybody who's in I would say a slightly higher risk environment. So instructors, tech divers, rebreather divers, cave divers. It's equally applicable to open water, advanced open water, and that sort of level. It's much harder to bring the relevance into the activity they're doing. But it's also scientific divers, military divers. Same sort of stuff as well.
That's excellent. And there's a cost associated to that.
Yeah, so that's $250. And what I'll do is I'll just find the page now, and I'll post it in the chat window.
Yep.
So 10-week webinar series. Chat. Here we go. That's available to everybody there. And
beautiful. I'll grab that out of there.
Yeah. And that's the second one is a micro class, the standard class that has been available really, which was put together as a way of pre-learning for the people in the 2-day class that we taught up at your place. And the people said, well, why don't you make this as a standalone product? Because the value can be learned there as well. It's the same stuff.
Yeah.
So it's the diving community is odd. like this, and that some will go, oh, it's too long. It's, it's 2.5 hours in total. And others go, well, it doesn't go into much detail here. That's all just like common sense. Okay,
Yep.
Fine. So yeah, we know what the education's like in diving.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
I
love the micro class. I've gone back through it a couple of times. I've been quite impressed by it. So, and it even tricks you when you don't expect it to. You're like, I know how this is gonna go. Like, oh, I messed it up again.
Exactly.
So, and then the forum's always active. I know on Facebook the forum. I posted that up. I can post that up again. But the forum is nice and active, and it's got a lot of good discussion. So that's a good thing for downtime to kind of chat with other people and get in some. I'll go discussions. We'll go considerably discussions.
It is good. It's a grown-up forum as well, which has realised that, and I don't have to do much moderation. There's little bits, but in the main, it's pretty grown up because people realise that actually that the whole concept of what I'm trying to teach is that people are fallible. And, you'll get a discussion piece or a little video clip or something, and it lulls people into, this is, they're stupid. It was obvious that was going to happen. And then you start to turn the story around and people go, oh yeah, I've made that mistake.
Yeah.
And it's this piece that, people ask me, how do you teach people this in a non-confrontational way when we come to diving? It's like, well, I start by not talking about diving. I talk about things like where you've left your keys in a house, or you've missed a step in a sequence, in terms of a shopping list, or you've done these stuff that's nothing to do with diving. And then segue into diving and saying, okay, that same thought process, that same communication or miscommunication that happened, that same lack of awareness that you've already described and accepted and know about in a non-diving framework, why would that be any different in the diving setup? And it's like, oh yeah. And then we start to explore things in a safe way that says that, you know what, we're all fallible, we all make mistakes. It doesn't matter how experienced you are, you will make mistakes. And the other bit is, no matter how experienced you are, you can always get better, even if it's only 1% or 0.5%. It's all about having the mindset that says, how do we get better at these things?
Right. Yep. It's been very interesting working with like the debrief model quite often and all that. We use a debrief model a lot, and seeing that of being like, okay, when we first start out, we're like, okay, you guys need to kind of talk about things you did that you could probably do better. Oh, I didn't do anything wrong. Okay, well, let's try this model. All right, so these are the things I did wrong, and we'll talk about debrief model in a minute. And then my biggest issue is, all right, so say something you did good. Well, no. Say something you did well. Like, just give me a statement of something you did well. I really didn't do this. Like, no, one thing you did well, and it changes the entire thing. So you can explain it way better than I can, but can you give me just or the people that are listening, just kind of an idea of what the debrief model is? Because we use it a ton. Yeah,
so the debrief model is a structure, and it follows the sort of the word debrief. Each of the letters has a meaning associated with it. And having a structured brief and a debrief really has a benefit for both you as the speaker, because now you know what you need to say. And it also has a benefit for the listener because they know what's coming up next. And so they can actually recognize that we don't need to raise some points early on because they're going to be covered later on from that. So the framework, the debrief itself, starts off with D, which is define the aims and goals of the dive, or of the training dive or the task at hand. Whilst I developed this for diving, it is applicable in all environments. So it's just about turning it around. So we'll talk about diving, but you can replace dive with task. So define the aims and goals of the dive, and did we achieve them? And then the next bit is define the length of the debrief. Is this going to be a 10-minute thing, or is this going to be about a 45-minute, an hour long? Doesn't really matter. Now, defining the aims and goals of the task and the dive, that means that you should have had a brief to start with. So what was the purpose of the dive? Now, it might be as simple as we want to get in, swim around, have some fun, and see some fish or a bit of wreck or something. Now, that gives you a baseline to say, yeah, actually, that was a successful dive because we achieved what it was. So start off with define the aims and goals. Did you achieve them? If not, well, we'll explore why that is. And if we did achieve them, we'll also explore. It's about setting the baseline. The next bit, the E, is about setting an example as a leader. Now, if we want to have a debrief as a learning opportunity, what that means is that the person who's leading the dive, be that an instructor or just as the team leader within the dive, we want to create learning within there. And for that to happen, we've got to have psychological safety. That means that we have got to be vulnerable. It doesn't mean that we open ourselves totally up to ridicule and things. It is about recognizing our fallibility and that we're not perfect. And so the E, set an example of leadership, talk about a mistake or an error that you made on that dive. Now that might be such a small thing. From an instructional setup, it might be that the instructor says, well, when you did that air share, I wasn't quite in the right place because I then couldn't see how you donated and made sure that you unfurled the long hose in the right way. That happened because I was distracted and we ran on from another drill and I didn't set myself up properly. Now that has two benefits. The first benefit is the fact that it shows I'm vulnerable, I'm fallible, I'm not perfect, I will make mistakes. The other benefit is that it allows the rest of the team to call you out if you start being criticizing others later on the debrief. So if you and I are in a debrief, Jason, and I don't do that, and I don't talk about a mistake that I've made, we come later on and we talk about something that's gone, didn't go to plan, and I'll go, oh, bloody hell, that was obvious that was going to happen. If I've talked about that already, you can say, well, hang on a minute, Gareth, you made a mistake too? Oh yeah, okay. And it empowers the people within the team to be able to speak up and challenge me if I'm leading the debrief. And that's really important when it comes to a student-instructor relationship, because we want the students to recognize that even the instructors, they may be awesome in the water, they're still fallible. We've got to be able to teach the students to be able to speak up. I get that there is a gradient that says, here's the instructor and here's the student. We can't be totally flat. There's always got to be something. But an instructor is a leader and they're leading a team of students. And what we're trying to do is reduce that gradient so that we teach the students that it is okay to challenge in the real world. And, in November last year, I filmed a documentary out in Hawaii, which was going to be released at Tech Dive, but that's obviously been pushed to the right. And there were two people, there's one of the people on the boat definitely felt that they should have said something at that time. And that's why the title of the documentary is If Only, and unfortunately it led to a fatality. That diver who sat there at the back of the boat going, you know what, this is rubbish. We need to be able to speak up. But culturally, they were all either serving or veterans. And so it was this piece that we don't critique in public. We praise in public and we critique in quiet. And unfortunately, Brian got off the boat with his oxygen turned off and died of hypoxia. And there was numerous opportunities to challenge what was going on, but we've got to create that psychological safety. So E is about setting the standard that says it is okay to talk about a mistake. This is what it happened, and how did it develop in the way it did? Because that's the other piece. Just making an observation without understanding the reality of it doesn't necessarily help learning. Then we're talking to B, which is basics or background. Anything prior to you getting off the boat or jumping in the water or getting into the cave, it's about the pre-execution phase. How was the planning? How was the briefing? Did everything work out how we were expecting in terms of, say, gas analysis, all the equipment that we wanted? Do we have any issues before we even got in the water that we decided that we were going to carry? So that is the pre-execution. Then we talk about review, R for review of execution. And that really is high level, 3 or 4 key points in the dive. That might be descending down the shot line. Was it where we were expecting? Then we turned off and we went down and visited that part of the wreck or so. These are big area points. It's not giving a one-to-one narrative of what happened on the dive because that just gets really boring. And then the real learning happens, which is the I and the E of debrief. The I is internal. What did I do well and why? what did I do? What do I need to do to improve? And how am I going to do it? And that there, out of those sort of four questions, what did I do well and why? What do I need to improve on and how? The two most important questions are why and how. Observations are easy. And we can say, oh yeah, the communications was good. All right, why was the communication was good? Or, and what do I need to improve in? Well, I need to have better teamwork. Well, that doesn't really help us either, because it doesn't say, how do we get better? Often debriefs end up in generalities. They're just general phrases that don't necessarily help anybody. And what I'd say to people is, team communications was good. Well, that doesn't help us learn. As a better example, when we were swimming along next to the wreck and you were pointing a light in front of me, I could see you were there all the time. So I knew you were in the right place and I knew you were there. Thank you. That's how we need to, continue to do that. That is a much bigger way of expanding on communications was good, because what was good about the communications? We need to be specific. And it might be a case of what do I need to improve on? Well, when I gave you the deco, how much deco we were going to do on that stop, I didn't get an acknowledgement back. I need to be more clear and get that response back, and I'm not going to carry on until I have got that response back. So again, we go back into the details rather than the generalities. So I is internal. What did I do well? What and why? What do I need to improve on and how? E is external. What did the team do well and why? What did the team need to improve on and how? And we go to exactly the same framework. We look for details and we look for stuff to reinforce and we look for stuff to fix the next time, how we're going to do it. And the way that I teach those debriefs is we run it, the team leader, the dive leader runs the debrief. It could be the instructor. They run through the D, E, B, R, and I and E for myself. And then I will go around the rest of the team and I'll say to Jason, I'll say to John, I'll say to Bob, okay, what's your I and E? What's your I and E? What's your I and E? And then we can actually get some clear learning, because the best part about the debrief is when stuff gets told and people go, oh, I didn't know that. Is that why you did that? All right. And you get these light bulb moments, and the whole benefit and the real reason for the debrief is so that we can learn and make better decisions the next time and improve our situational awareness. And the final piece for the F for the debrief is follow up or file. So we've just done an activity, we've just done a dive, we've gone through the debrief, so we've identified a bunch of stuff that we could learn from, and then the F is about putting it in place. That might be that we need to file an incident report, or we need to submit some new paperwork, we need to modify our procedures, we need to fix that O-ring that's bubbling that happens. And it's just like, yeah. And then, if you don't actually put a process in place to address those issues you've identified, the next dive, you'll go off and you'll identify those same issues again. Oh man, I wish I'd done this. And sometimes it's not as simple as just saying, I will fix it. It's about coming up with another process to trap you. So I had a student on a class recently, they live out and work out in Egypt. They run multiple dives in the day, and they leave their stages on the reef while they go off and do sort of lunch and debrief, and then they get back in again. And so they end up with sand and grit and things like this. And at the end of the day, they'll finish the second dive, and it's like, oh, the reg's bubbling. I need to remember that. And then somebody else cleans up the cylinders that are on the reef, and the regs don't get sorted because they're too busy doing other things. So I said, come up with another process that says, when you go to close the dive center down at the end of the day, there should be a notice board, a checklist that says any kit needs servicing. And there's a prompt for people to go, oh yeah, because if we've forgotten something, the chances of us remembering it are pretty slim until there is a trigger point that says, I need to do that. So coming up with thinking about, why do we fail? Why do we forget things? So that's why the debrief structure is the way it is, so that we can remember what the letters are, and we get to the end of the debrief, make a note in the wet notes, or put a knot in your reg to know that it needs to be dealt with as like sort of a knot in a piece of string. something to trigger that memory.
Yeah.
So it was a good blast of what the debrief's about.
Oh god, and so much comes out of that, because that's the exact same experience we've had with it. Is you start to change these things, start to add them, and we've started utilizing Google Sheets that people can change at the pool so that it shows up at the shop and we can all see it, and all these things to encourage communication.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah, so it pops up on a TV in the back room, so we know like what equipment they need, and if gear needs service, it can go right on there. If the student has some particular need or something we really need to work on, it pops right up, and everyone has communication, which has been great. So many things come out of that debrief conversation. You hit on so many things when you talk about it that so like closed loop communication. Let's talk a second about closed loop communication. So many people don't really do great closed loop communication. They
any closed loop
or any, yeah. They throw a signal at somebody, and then one of the other notes I had is basically the failure of the okay hand signal. So if I give you a deco hand signal and you just give me okay back, everybody just throws okay. And it's just automatic. You threw me a hand signal, yeah, sure, whatever. But there was no identification of actually like understanding. So can you talk a minute about that as opposed to me
sure. So
on?
I'll talk about sort of basic communication to start with, and what lots of people think communication, and to a certain extent it is I transmit information, and that is communication. Now, the assumption is that you've heard it and you've understood it and you've understood the intent, and you will then action on that. And that's simple one-way communications. And there's one of the examples in the class, if I said to you tree, what would you mean? What's the first, describe the sort of first tree that you're talking about if I said tree?
Oh, probably a maple tree.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is that because there's lots of maple trees around you?
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
So I was thinking of a conifer, because that's, or a leylandia actually, because that's what we've got in our back garden. So I could say tree, but it's a very nondescript word. And it's like saying deco and then you go okay back. Well, that doesn't really help, because I don't know if okay means okay, or okay, I've understood, or yes, I'm going to do that. So we have, simple communications goes out that way, and we don't get anything meaningful back. Closed loop communications is where I give you a specific piece of information and you come back with some information and I confirm. So I'll go deco here 2 minutes, and I would expect you to go deco here 2 minutes. And now I know that you've understood what it is. Now, underwater, there's a limited amount of vocabulary, just because of, you can get the wet notes out. Now that's much easier, because now you can write some stuff. So your communication is much more simplified underwater. And as long as we've got standard hand signals, that can help us. Because if I did that to you, what would that mean?
Hold.
Okay, so other people might be 500 PSI or 50 bar.
Yep.
So when we end up mixing sort of recreational and technical diving, we could have some miscommunication that's there.
Absolutely.
So arranging, being clear what hand signals mean before we get in the water is really important. So the closed loop communications, there's two parts to it in terms of surface type. Is I will say your name as well. So I'll say Jason. And as soon as I say your name, your ears will prick up and go, oh, this is for me. And now I can give you an instruction, and then you can confirm back to me what that instruction is. Now, if I really want to check your understanding, I might give you a longer piece, and then I'll say, in your own words, what does that mean? Because if I said to you, in your own words, now you have to understand and translate it and come back to me. Because the normal response would be, did you understand that? And the response would be, yes, because I don't want to show that I haven't understood it. I don't want to look stupid in front of my peers, because they all obviously did, because they're all looking happy and I'm not quite understanding. And I may not want to have that conversation. But if I ask you to tell me what I've just told you, well, if you just parrot back to me exactly my words, that doesn't check that you've understood what it is. So actually, if I say to you, tell me in your own words what that means, now you have to do a bit of comprehension to say, what does that mean? And as an example, when we do a rec brief and we're going to go down the shot line, and the guide or the leader describes what's going to happen on the dive. And the normal question would be, does everybody understand that? And always it will be, yeah, okay, we understand that.
God, I hate that one.
Yeah, exactly.
You know how to do this, right? Yes. All right. Okay, good.
So you almost create the situation where failure will happen.
Mm-hmm.
So a way of saying, okay, you've just done this. Jason, we're going to go on the shot line. What are you going to see and which way we're going to turn? And how do you know which way to turn? And now it's like, I don't know. All right, brilliant. And you know, if I'm giving the brief, I don't even have to hear you say those words. I can see your body language that has that sort of confusion on your face. And you go, all right, fine. And you don't need to say, I'll save you the embarrassment, because that closes the conversation down as well. Mm-hmm. It's this bit of, okay, I wasn't clear enough, because that's one of the key bits of communication. If I'm speaking to you, Jason, and you don't understand me, most of that is on me to make sure that you've understood it. And I might need to simplify the message. I might need to draw a picture. That is a valid way of communicating. So we need to understand, you know, from a communicator point of view, does the listener understand? And you can pick up that lack of comprehension, a lot of it on non-verbal communications. Does the person have a face that doesn't look quite right? Mm-hmm. You know, it's like, oh, all right, fine. I've missed that point. I will explain again, because now I'm showing that it's my problem, not yours. Well, I told you once. It's how much more do you need? Oh, great. Well, that means that I'm never going to ask any questions again, because I don't want to be looked like, you know, made a fool of in front of the rest of us. Yeah. So communication really is powerful.
Yeah, that communication thing with classroom management of being like, okay, clearly I didn't explain this the way that you understand. Like, let's go back through and let me see if I can figure out some other way to do that. It makes it so much easier. And you have to read that body language. And saying someone's name just brings up the fact that, all right, everybody, you might send, like, as you're talking, I'm writing stuff down like, oh, I want to talk about that. Like, all right, so I'm not drifting off. I got a pretty good job of coming back at you. But other students might start to write and be like, start daydreaming and thinking about what they're going to talk about next. And then active listening is gone. And you got to give them that opportunity to come back around and say, okay, like, let's process that and see, what are you working on? What's going on in your head? What are you trying to figure out? Which is, you know, what's stuck on?
Exactly. And so that piece there, we're talking, you know, trying to bring people back into the classroom and making sure, into the room, and making sure that they are paying attention. I don't know whether or not it's, you know, part of your instructor training. One of the bits that I was taught when I was going through my own military development was this pose, pause, pounce. Yep. Because if you pose the question to everybody and then pause so that people comprehend, and then you nominate an individual. And at that stage, everybody thinking, oh, is the question for me? Whereas actually, Jason, what I'd like you to do is explain this. And as soon as I say Jason, everybody else goes,
I'm free.
For me. Uh-huh. So, and, you know, there's lots of little tricks in terms of how we manage that communication, whether or not we have open or closed questions. You know, understanding what is the purpose of that. There are lots of times where closed questions, like, what's your gas pressure? Which, you know, tell me the direction we're going to swim. What's the maximum depth? What's your maximum endurance? Well, all of those things you can answer with closed responses. But if you want to be curious and you want to check understanding, that's where you ask open questions. And describe is the easiest way of asking an open question. Describe to me what you're going to do. Because it's very difficult to answer that yes, no. And if you do, you're going to look like a bit of a fool in front of everybody else, because they know you're going to be avoiding the question. Mm-hmm. So that's the easiest word to start a question set with, if you want to be curious.
Yeah. So one of the things going back to the debrief model that you had talked about previously, is you mentioned in giving feedback, it's kind of an offshoot of it, but in giving feedback, like, oh, the way you had that light position really helped me out. And this is, since you said that, it brings up something I struggle with as a tactical instructor all the time. People are like, why do I need a light? Because basically that's my body language. Like, I'm watching your light. I am looking to see what the deal is. And people are like, I don't need the light. Like, you do, from a team perspective. Like, I need to be able to give a glance and go 1, 2, 3. All right, we got a team of 4. I see my light. We're good. Those aren't shaking. They're not moving. Everybody's good. And at least we can communicate that way. And I think people don't realize that I count that as a form of body language, that I'm looking at that definitely as body language. Yeah.
So when I started diving, I trained in GUE in 2006. I did fundamentals. And then I used to diving in the primary light. And then I went diving with some of my old club who would just didn't know anything about this. And you'd see the lights waggling around, and it's like you turn around and go, oh, what's up? And it was a bit like the boy who cried wolf all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start to sort of disengage from that. An exercise we did with some friends to show the importance of light was the fact that we were swimming in limited visibility, probably, I'm going to say 20 feet or so, less than that. And what we did was we then basically hung back and just see how long it was before they swam off. And they reached the limit of visibility. And we basically sat at the limit of visibility, swimming behind them. And it took a while. And this bit about, keeping an eye on your buddy, normal swimming pace, you can go a long way, and you've then lost them.
Yep.
Now, all right, fine. I know there is solo diving. It's not what I do. And teams are there because you can provide mutual support to each other. Now you're in this situation that you're on your own. You're going to try and find each other. Otherwise, you thumb the dive. And there are lots of people who swim around at the bottom because they go, oh, I want to be down here. I've missed my buddy, and it'll be okay. And they've compromised their safety net that's there. And so one of the benefits of having a light is actually we don't have to end the dive quite so early, because you will notice when somebody is missing because the light's not there anymore. Now, I get that when you've got, Caribbean reefs, it's a different ball game. It just doesn't work as well. In which case, you now have to be much closer so that you can just look at each other simply, as opposed to, where are they?
Yeah.
Because as humans, we're efficient creatures. We don't like to expend energy, and we don't like to, anything that we can do to reduce friction in our decision-making process has got to be a good thing. So if you're going to be in really good conditions, be close to each other, so you can look across. The temptation is then you then come a long way apart because, hey, I've got 100 foot visibility.
Yeah.
It can be over there.
Yeah.
All right. Can you do a half breath hold swim on 100 feet? Maybe not. Okay. So it's now up or it's across. Which one are you going to do? So, yeah. Once people get passive light communications, it is so hard to give it up. And you're right about the body language. You can see where people are agitated. Right. So
yeah, you got that notorious person that's above you, behind you, and you're like this way, and then they're up there, and you're like, oh, God, where are you? At least with a light, they can shine it, and you're like, why are you there? Come on down.
Which is, when you then come to the debrief, is you can say, actually, where you were, I couldn't see you, and that was acting as a stressor, and that meant that my dive wasn't as enjoyable. Well, what are you stressed about? Because I'm responsible for you, and in terms of a team, we are mutually responsible for each other.
Exactly.
And we're trying to look out for each other. And if you're not there, I need to know where you are, because we've got this mutual piece. Yeah. I get it. It's hard.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things we ran into, and I don't know your opinion on this, I don't think we've discussed this before, but when you start doing the debrief of plan versus goal and what your goals are, and I think people have different discussions on this and why, but we ran into a little bit of an incident where people's plans were their goals. I want to hit 155 feet. My take personally is that's not a goal. That's a plan. Unless you specifically are training to move up to a portion where I'm going to a known spot for 155 because that's where the wreck's going to be and I'm running a thing. But just to reach a goal of 160 feet or 130 feet for recreational people. What's your take on plans versus goal, and should they be different?
Yes, and I'm aligned with your position there. I had an interesting discussion with an organization recently. They were talking about doing, because they've got a currency requirement to go and do a 200-foot dive to maintain their currency for their qualifications. And I said, so what's the purpose of that? Well, because we've got to hit 200 feet. Okay, and does that mean you've got any time limit while you're down there? We can do a bounce dive to 200 feet and that's it. Okay, so what's the purpose of going to there? Are you going to do some skills? No, we're just going to swim around. Okay, this is a planning exercise. All right, fine. So do you need to go to 200 feet just for that? Probably not. So the plan to me is, what is it you're going to achieve as part of the executed process? But goals shouldn't drive the plans unless what you're saying there is it is a specific requirement. But I would say even at a training agency piece of, right, you have a 200-foot ticket from a class, right, we are going to dive to 200 feet. Why? Or even, what's even bigger is the 300-foot ticket, right? What we're going to do is we're going to dive to 300 feet and we'll get a ticket there because I can say that I've dived to 300 feet. Okay, so what's the purpose of the training dive? It's to give you the skills to execute the dive properly and manage contingency operations. Do you need to be at 300 feet to do that? Maybe not. Okay, so why expose yourself to a risk that doesn't necessarily need to be there?
Right.
So in terms of the goal, what is it with depth? To me, separating depth should not be goals, full stop. Yeah. So activities can be goals, but then they are built into the plan, but depth should not be goals for depth's sake. If you're going to go and take a photo of a wreck that's at 300 feet, that is what the goal is. It is not about getting 300 feet on my computer to say, "Woo, I've done 300 feet."
Yeah, work up dives, getting there. I want to work out my kit. I'm working with some other people. We're trying to do some deeper ones where you don't have any other distractions. Okay, that's fine. But just, I want to hit this number to hit this number. And what we've seen with that, which I'm sure that with accident analysis and stuff like that is, so suddenly your goal is this, but it's also your dive plan. Well, it makes it very hard for a person we've discussed this before, it makes a person hard to turn because, all right, we're at say it's recreational, they say we're at 120, we're trying to get to 130, but we should turn at 120. Well, I'm only 10 feet away. Like, all right, now you're starting to put that psychology in of being like, well, that depth adds a little bit of safety concern. You should be able to turn. Yeah.
So yeah, there's a concept, destructive goal pursuit. There's a lot of issues out there. Everest is a classic one with the multiple fatalities and the two world-renowned guides there, and understanding the pressures behind them. And Doc Deep is a classic diving example of I've got to get this done, and multiple people and saying, no, this isn't how we should be doing it.
Right.
And surrounding yourself with yes people is not, is guaranteed you to try to get to the goal. What you want is somebody who's going to be a dissenter, who's going to challenge what's there and say, no, actually, we need to change. We need to back off from this. Yeah. And that is also part of the strength of a team. This piece that anybody can thumb a dive at any time for any reason is easy to say, but it's much harder to actually do. However, in the brief, if you have stated those non-crossables, the lines in the sand, and that might be gas consumption, it might be time, it might be depth. But as long as you've outlined those early on, then we've got some clarity, and that gives those within the team something to hang their hat on and say, no, we agreed this, and we are turning around now. I don't care if we've got, the bell is over there. No, we're going to, we've got to go back up. Yeah. But we might get that. And, it's one of the case studies in the micro class is of a guy who was trying to recover an anchor who did 200 feet to the surface in 120 seconds because the goal fixation and unsurprisingly died. And the goal fixation was all about recovering the anchor from the bottom. And unfortunately, it cost him his life when he ran out of gas because he'd sent up a couple of lift bags already and he just ran out of gas. And his buddy was there, but there's a lot of psychological pressure of, I don't want to be the fool. I don't want to go to you because I've run out of gas. And people go, well, that's irrational. Yeah, people are predictably irrational. Yeah. But if we understand that process, what we can do is try and manage that a bit better. And there's a lot of human factor stuff in that case study that's highlighted for people to learn. There's
some interesting ones out there with all that stuff, looking at, the micro class and the book and all that stuff and the different case studies of, you're like, like you said, like, well, that's predictable. Why would they do that? It's completely predictable. That's foolish, but there's so much that goes into it, which kind of leads us into, well, two things. One quick, and then we'll get to the bigger one. The be careful or be more aware.
Yeah. The worst accident sort of analysis, or the corrective actions of be careful, be safe, pay more attention.
Yeah.
You lost situational awareness. You go, okay, fine. We have a finite capacity to pay attention to what's going on. And a concept I came across last year, and I don't know if we covered it in your class actually, was this DIPI. So if something is, we've got the five senses and we're processing lots and lots of information, and we're ditching most of it because we go, it's irrelevant. Oh, that's interesting. Squirrel. So our brains are wired to look for things that are dangerous, they're interesting, they're pleasurable, or they're important. If they sit in one of those four things, then our attention will be drawn to them, and that means that our attention drops everything else we were looking at. And that's this problem with saying pay more attention. We can't pay more attention. It's a finite capacity. We can jump around the scene and pick up things, but we've got to know what's important, which again goes back to the value of the debrief, because you might be diving with a more experienced person, you might pick up something that's important in terms of, say, current or visibility or depth or hazards that are on site, or even just undertaking the task. So to say to somebody, pay more attention, the better question is, what was taking your attention away from the thing in question? And the normal thing that we miss is gas consumption. That we are task loaded. We've not got into a habit that says every 5 minutes we check our gas, our depth, our time, and a general idea of where we are. If we haven't got that, we need something to trigger our gas consumption. And that means that we've got to recognize it's important, and it might be that the fish are more important, the photography is important, the videography or the line laying, whatever that task is, will take our attention away from monitoring the gas. So we've got to be conscious of the fact that we perceive the task work that needs to be done to be more important than the looking after our gas or our deco limits or our PO2 from a rebreather.
Yep.
And we've got to recognize that we are fallible in that sense. And if we recognize we're fallible, we can start to develop strategies to mitigate that. But just to say, be careful, pay more attention, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and those lists of things you listed are ridiculously more important than the picture and all that stuff. The PO2, the gas consumption, the no NDL, like no deco stuff, like all that, or well, no stop limits. But like that's so much more.
It is in hindsight,
right?
And this is the difficulty when we look at incidents and accidents. We've got a clarity that was not available to those at the time, because we know what the outcome is with 100% certainty, because that's what history shows. And as we look back through time, we start to pick up relevant factors that lead to that, because we know their significance, we know it's important or relevant, and we start going, oh, there's that, and there's that, and there's that, and there's that. In real time looking forward, we don't know what the future looks like with 100% reliability, with 100% certainty. So we make best guesses of what we think the future will look like, and we start going that way. And if we don't know that something is important, we won't see it.
Yep.
So it's easy in hindsight to judge things, and I think that's one of the bits that I'm so passionate about, is trying to get people to look at things differently. Ultimately, it must have made sense for that person to do whatever they did, even if it was, in hindsight, blatantly obvious it was going to end up as a disaster. It can't have been that obvious to the individual, because otherwise they wouldn't have done that activity. So what we need to look at is, how did it make sense for them to do it? Not why, because why is a judgmental word. I'm asking you to justify to me why you did it. If I asked you, how did it make sense? Now I'm asking you to create a narrative that's not about you as an individual. It's about the activity itself. And so it's depersonalized, and we've got a much better chance of actually learning from it, because people don't feel threatened by having to tell a how story as opposed to a why story.
Yeah. One of the things we took, now that we've got all this downtime at this point, we're going to be able to actually execute a little bit better. But so one of the things that we've been talking about from the instructor standpoint is, all right, so pilots make checklists. Okay. Technical divers make checklists. Rebreather divers should be using the checklists. Unfortunately, the number of people that jump in with their O2 off is ridiculously high. I don't really understand that, but that's a checklist issue. And then we get to open water students and we go, nah, you can just memorize this acronym we gave you and you'll be good.
Yeah.
So we're going to start printing off checklists for our students so they can have it on a little plastic card. You know, we've got the card printer because we can print it. But so we're going to start printing off those cards and just making more checklists, which I think is a massive benefit.
It's a big step forward. I suppose another way of solving that problem, and I'm, a big, strong advocate of checklists that make sense and they fit the operational environment. If you're going to be diving on your own, a written checklist and following it with a place marker like your finger is really important. If you're diving in as a pair or a team, then using a verbal checklist like DWRAF and cross-checking what the other person does is a good way, because actually what I'm doing is as a team, we will hold each other accountable to what the standard is.
Yep.
And again, we go back to developing teamwork and psychological safety. If we're diving together and I say B for buoyancy and I do my bits and I expect you to do, and you haven't done it, I'm able to challenge you and say, no, actually, Jason, show us your buoyancy stuff. Oh, okay, and I'll do this. So checklists have a place, definitely. What we don't want to do is put checklists in for checklists. So it's just for the sake of it. And as an example, we've had issues in the UK with the surgical safety checklist, where trusts are, the hospitals and the groups are punished for when those checklists are not complete. So all that happens now is you end up with a tick box exercise. And I would say certain parts of the dive industry are very similar as well, where as long as the paperwork and the slates are all ticked off, then you're safe. And you sit there and go, actually, it's the action associated with the checklist is what keeps you safe, not the checklist itself. It's a tool to facilitate performance. The checklist should not be the metric of performance. It should be the action associated with that.
Yep. So what I've started doing with my scientific divers is I give them an assignment where they come in with their checklist and they're bring in your checklist, your pre-dive checklist. So they bring it in and I go, cover it up, read it back to me, pure memorization. And they're like, I kind of got through it. Maybe I'm making some things up. I said, well, and like you said, it's meaningful. So I'm like, who wrote that? Somebody someplace else wrote that. So we make our own checklist in our scientific diving class, being like, okay, make your checklist. We're going to make it in a Google Doc. Everybody can add to it, and then we're going to streamline it and tweak it. But you're going to make your checklist so it's meaningful to you because, and then we oversee it with someone that's got experience because like you can't leave certain things off. But so we've been doing that exercise.
And the advantage of having that, and so the benefit of checklists is the standardization across the community that will use them. And this is where I have a bit of an issue with rebreather students writing their own pre-dive checklists based on their instructors' teachings. And what happens then is if those rebreather divers dive with other rebreather divers, you have an inconsistent checklist. So when we are reading those checklists, is it, and we're cross-checking each other, is it that you didn't do something because you missed it out, or is it because it's not in your checklist? And so that's the real benefit of checklists across a community, is we can hold each other accountable to that. I get the reason why is now you understand how your rebreather is built and how you need to get it put together for you. Like, okay, that's fine for you, but we should be looking at the team, and then we can hold each other accountable when the checklists aren't done.
Yeah, and
I get that is a big conflict. Now, if you're just teaching those scientific divers and they come up with the same, and you can nudge them in the way of coming up with a standardized checklist, that's great.
Yeah,
because now they can start to hold each other accountable when they go back to their research units.
We bring it back full circle and compare everything, and then make sure that everything's there. Maybe it's their own wording, but it's the same kind of standardized type of thing. But it's we go round and round. So let's talk about just culture a little bit, because apparently I'm going back to the medical field for the next few weeks and helping out. So just culture is always a good discussion, and we got about 10 minutes or so left for our planned talk. So let's go ahead and talk about just culture a little bit.
Yeah, just culture is fundamentally, it's recognizing that we are fallible, and we should take into account the experience and the skill set and the knowledge and the drivers of the individual at that time. But at the same time, recognizing that willful negligence, sabotage, and violations for personal gain need to be punished. Now, punishment shouldn't be the first toolbox, the first tool that comes out of the box, because we've got to understand the context. And again, we go back to, how did it make sense for that person to be there? So within the aviation industry, that's where it's been driven a lot, because they recognize that there are so many stories that could be told about errors and mistakes and rule breaking that's there, that if we don't unearth them and we don't share them, the community as a whole does not improve. And there is legal protection for most aviation organizations at a national level. So they're in a unique position that allows them to have legal protection, that information that is submitted in an incident report for safety purposes cannot be used for punishment or disciplinary action. And that protects the individuals to be candid and open and talk about the mistakes and the errors and the violations that they themselves have made. The organizations, it might be the airlines, or it might be their traffic agency or the maintenance company, they will do an internal investigation to understand what the systemic problems were. Because if people are making the same mistakes again and again, it is unlikely to be an individual issue. It's more likely to be a systemic issue. And so we've got to be able to tell those context-rich stories with some level of protection. Now, the diving industry is a bit difficult with that, especially in the States, where litigation just the drop of a hat. And I take my hat off to anybody who teaches out there because of the constant threat of being sued. And whilst insurance might pay and you might win, it's a pain. It takes time and it takes money. And as a whole, the premiums go up across the industry. So the just culture piece is, let's understand how it made sense. Get them to tell a context-rich narrative, lots of details. What were the drivers? How much money have they got? Are they running short of cash, which is why they haven't undertaken this? And people go, well, if you don't have the money, you shouldn't go diving. Well, that's really easy when you've got money and you're able to go diving and they haven't. Yep. So they're making a constant trade-off behind these sort of decisions. And because the community doesn't talk about these sorts of issues very often, we don't know the real prevalence. So we don't know how risky it is. And we could say the same thing about corona globally at the moment.
Yeah.
We've only got the tip of the iceberg. We don't know how much is out there, but we're trying to make informed decisions. And because we've got a lot of media interest, now that's raising the concerns that are there. So in the diving industry, we don't talk about the near misses that are there because there is a fear of being put down or retribution in a social media manner, because there are those who, the Monday morning quarterbacks or armchair quarterbacks, what do you call them, just sit there and go, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Okay, well, that's fine, but you're not that person.
Yep.
So let's understand their experience knowledge. So one of those questions is, look at a peer environment. Would somebody with the same knowledge, the same experience, the same drivers, the same equipment, skill set, would they make the same mistake? Yes. All right, it's not an individual issue. And it's trying to divorce yourself when you ask those questions from the knowledge of the outcome. Because it's really easy to sit there and go, well, yeah, because they would have seen that. They go, why didn't they? Mm-hmm. And it's about turning these things on our heads. And that's really, and I think things have started to change, I would say, probably in the last 5 years. more so in the last couple, where people are now starting to look at incidents from a different perspective rather than, well, they were stupid. That was obvious. I wouldn't have done that. All right, fine. Let's put you, and I think that's where the classes that I teach, where I put people in uncertain situations, they've never encountered it before, and they all make the same mistakes.
Yep.
Because we're all wired the same way. And I've manufactured a situation that makes errors more likely because we've got stress, we've got time, we've got things that need to be done. There's a competitive factor. And all that does is it creates greater error-producing conditions so that people are more likely to make a mistake. And we debrief it in a non-confrontational manner. And that's really what, which I don't know if you're going to touch on, if only, because that's where I would like to go now.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Which then segues into this fatality that happened in May 2018 with Brian Bucky, who got off the back of a boat on a training dive on a rebreather with his oxygen turned off. And he drowned a few minutes later when he went hypoxic because his loop went hypoxic. He was in the shallows. The rebreather was still in surface mode, so it was planned on a PO2 of 0.4. The oxygen cylinder was turned off. He pre-breathed on the boat. It was a bright sunny day. He's got a head-up display. There's a buddy light. He should have been monitoring the handsets. But there are a whole bunch of other issues which we're going to cover in the documentary. And what I really want for that documentary is to turn the people's perspective around from saying that shouldn't have happened because this failed, this failed, this failed. Yeah, I know those all failed. That's telling a story that happened. Yeah, we know that, but let's understand how it made sense for that situation to be there, and look at things differently. It's a very emotive documentary. We've got it's nearly 30 minutes long. We've got 15 minutes worth of face-to-camera work with Ashley, who's the widow, and we've got 3 other team members on the boat that day, and telling their narrative of the months and days and hours going up to the dive as to what was creating the conditions that were there, such that Brian felt pressured. Unfortunately, we can't ask him because he's dead. And that's another thing is fatalities, in my perspective, are a rubbish way of learning because you can't ask the decision maker how it made sense because they're normally dead, which is why near misses become really important. So we've got a rough idea of how it made sense for Brian to do what he did and why it was difficult for the others to question and challenge what was going on. And to be able to tell it in a really, it's a powerful story. It's very emotive. And so there's the narratives, and then I bring the theory into it near the end and explain how it made sense for them to do what they did and what we can do differently as a community to change attitudes to errors and violations and try and create a better just culture. We're not going to get to the level of aviation because we're never going to get the legal protection that's there, but we can certainly change things at a dive club, at an expedition level, at a small community level, maybe at a training agency level, but as a global community, I'd love it, but it's not going to happen.
No. So before I go on to the next kind of topic, release of the film, what's the plan? Do you guys have a plan now for that? Because I was curious about that.
So it really depends on what's happening around the globe at the end of April. Okay. The scheduled release date is the 25th of April. That was going to be on Saturday lunchtime at Tech Dive USA, which has been postponed. If things are all going horribly wrong around the globe with regard to coronavirus, we will push it back later in the year. Okay. Because it just wouldn't be right to do that. Yep. And the idea is that will be released globally. It will go out on YouTube and Vimeo. And I'm in the process of putting together a workbook that will be available to run in parallel with the video. So instructors, instructor trainers, training agencies can use this as a training tool that says, okay, so this is about situational awareness and decision making and communications and teamwork, leadership, and performance shaping factors. All of these non-technical skills that go into making a high performance team is we can pull apart the documentary and give them something that they can talk to their students about.
Good. So I got two topics I want to talk about. You can do them whatever order you want to do them based off of as you see fit. Survivorship bias and normalization of deviance. I think those both kind of stem from what you got going from the last conversation we had. And so I don't know which order you want to do them in, but go right ahead.
I'll do survivorship bias first, and then I'll go into normalization of deviance, because I think that's probably the more important way.
Yeah.
Survivorship bias is you get there and you don't necessarily realize, or you look at others and how they succeeded, the tip of the iceberg, and you don't see how much failure was required to get to that point. The modern sort of GoPro culture of, we see some amazing stills and video footage, and we think we can replicate that really easily. And we don't see the amount of blood, sweat, and tears, and hardship, and money, and time investment to get to that point. And it's great to idolize these people, but we don't see that stuff because that's not sexy. We don't see how much effort's required to be good as an instructor or as an explorer from that perspective.
Yep.
And as a consequence, as a community, we don't share our bad stories. So all we see is the good stuff, and we don't see those little things that are going wrong. And if we knew how often those little things go wrong, then actually we might change our behaviors, which then leads into that normalization of deviance piece. That we have standards, we have, and I'll basically use a little model to describe this. We have standards, we have safety protocols, we have processes that are in place. And I get that a lot of the training agencies there, the way that they're written, those standards are written, yes, it's about performance in the class, but it's also about protecting organizations from liability.
Yeah.
So we have some standards that are here, and we dive against those. And then we make some errors and we make mistakes and things, and we don't notice that because we don't have any feedback, we don't have a debrief or anything else like that. But we start to deviate, as humans do, which is normal to drift. And so we drift a little bit, and now we set this up as our new baseline. And that might take days, weeks, months, and we've now got a new standard. And we start operating there. And we start drifting a bit further, and we now start operating this. Nothing bad has happened at this stage, but we're getting more efficient, we're getting better at what we do, we can get more students through a class, we can go longer, we can make our cylinders last longer, and all of these bits, and we're eroding the safety margins. We don't know where these things are, so we set another baseline and we drift a bit. We carry on doing this, and we get to a point where we step over the cliff, and we don't know where that cliff edge is, because just the way that safety works, there are multiple factors. And in hindsight, people go, how come you drifted from here to here? And you go, I didn't go from there to there. I went from here to here. Well, no, there's the standards, and this is what you're doing. Yeah, but we deal with things in relative rather than absolute terms. So I'm looking at a little delta here that's just become normal. And you can say an easy example in diving is minimum gas. We start off with be on the surface with 500 psi or 50 bar. Well, to me, that's a meaningless concept anyway, because you don't know how much you're going to ascend.
Right.
But so let's say that we're going to leave the bottom with 800 psi, and over a period of time, we start to extend our bottom time. We start to see things, and we erode that to 700 psi. And it's like, well, it's only 100 psi. It's not that much of a problem. So we now set the baseline at 700 psi to leave the bottom for a standard depth. And then after a while, we start to extend our things, because actually when we get back on the boat, we've got loads of gas. Why do I need to give that gas back to the dive shop? I can get more time underwater. So I now erode that, and I'll say, right, I'm going to get to 500 bar, leave the bottom with 500 psi, and I'll ascend with that. And we start to erode those margins. Then all of a sudden, we end up having a situation where we've got a gas share with somebody, or we've got a stronger current to go to, or something like this. And we actually run out of gas on the ascent because we haven't taken into account. And people would go, why did you go from 700 psi to, or 800 psi to here? You go, no, I was only eroding a little margin. And that's why having standards is really important. And that's why I was saying about team standards. If you know what the team standard is, you can hold each other accountable to it. And you can call each other on it. And recognizing that, people can thumb a dive at any time. Well, they should just get a big cylinder. Okay, that works for them until you do a gas sharing situation, and they're now breathing off your cylinder.
Yeah.
And they've got a higher consumption rate than you. and now you don't have enough gas to ascend to the surface.
Yep.
So these biases are there all the time. They allow us to get things, to eke little bits out of the system, but they all erode our safety margins. And as a team, as an organization, whatever, you need to define what those are, and then it's much easier to call a dive and hold each other accountable.
Yeah. I think that really puts right into effect what I think I saw it on the Instagram, your Instagram account, was the absence of accidents is not safety. That's that concept of, just because, I could quite literally take a bow and arrow and shoot an arrow out my front door right now. If I don't kill somebody, it doesn't mean it's safe. There's nothing safe about that, but
Definitely.
Yeah.
So building on that one is, safety is not just the absence of accidents and incidents, but rather the presence of barriers and defenses and the capacity of the system to fail safely. So whatever we're doing, it's about this bit of, if we fail, when we fail, are we able to fail safely? And there's a limit to how many failures you can deal with in terms of catastrophic failures. So you've got to manage that point. And that's normally going to be based on biases of how much feedback you get. But whatever you do, ask that question: if it goes wrong, how do I deal with this? Not, it might not, or it's about, when does it go wrong? How do we deal with it?
Yeah, that's good. Swiss cheese model, just a quick little teaser. Don't go too far. We'll leave it at just a general, and then let people look it up and find it on the website. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds great. Right. Swiss cheese model, 1990, Professor James Reason, the guy behind the book Human Error, came up with a concept that said, we put these barriers in place, but because we humans are fallible, those barriers are never perfect. And so they allow an error to propagate through to a failure. And the reason why it's a Swiss cheese model is because you can line slices of cheese up, and when you look right through the hole, then we end up with an accident. It's a really simple model. It's probably too simplistic, but it gets the idea across that there are things that we can do to reduce the size of those holes, reduce the number of them, and then potentially plug them, because as people, we create safety all the time, because none of the procedures are perfect. None of the equipment is perfect. The environment changes all the time. So we as individuals dynamically create safety to plug those holes. And it's when we run out of fingers is when we end up with accidents.
Good deal. Cool. We have, not that the time really matters all that much to me, but we have ran over a little bit, and I think we've covered a whole lot of stuff. As always, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you. I enjoy it every single time. Really so, and I'll post some links up, and this will be saved on Facebook Live on the Facebook account. So we'll go from there. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate it. And anybody got any questions, I'm open for contact, and Jason will put the contact details there. I love it. I'm really passionate about this topic. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you, Jason, for the invite.
Thanks, Gareth. Have a great night. All right. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.